But right, so after a vote, we've gone for the sort of wood as opposed to the big pink flower. So we've gone for something quite craggy. And what I think we're looking at is this sense of the wood kind of marching off into the sea. So we've obviously got a very strong, as we're doing a sort of water sea painting, we've got this very strong sense of horizon happening across here. So I'm going to start by putting that in. Obviously, I'm going to be using a blue. I've got a nice square brush, which I found, which is one of my favourites that I couldn't find last week, and it arrived, I found it hidden under my bench, and so I was like reunited after a long absence, and I was like, oh bless, here he is. So this is a 1-inch square ended brush, and I tend to, honestly, I was bereft without him, because I do tend to do an awful lot of painting with him. So I put a very light misting of water on here first, just to start the paint going, and I'm going to start with my horizon line, or a stretch across for the horizon line, and just in water first, and then I'm going to come on and I'm going to use sort of like the square side of that, or the corner of the brush, to define that kind of horizon point. So we want whatever kind of blue you feel like your sea being. We can go for, the Mediterranean kind of glorious blue, or we could, you can stick a hint of grey into it and go for that more, shall we say, British kind of blue, which tends to be, has that hint of sort of greyness in it. So I'm just going to bring a line across, following where I should have put the water to begin with, and that's just to sort of establish where my sort of horizon point is going to be. So let's just bring that. We're not going to do a representational landscape completely, but I want to have these elements of horizon and straightness in it like that, just sort of coming down the page. So once I've got that in, then there's going to be a band going across here of sort of yellow, of sort of seaness, I think. I'm going to keep going with this blue. I may just keep this blue going across. Maybe we'll ignore the beach and just keep this sort of stripe of blue as a kind of background across. So let's bring some elements of sweeping colour across there, just to sort of bring those in. And I want to get some runs of the paint happening, so plenty of water on. Let's see if we can get something quite exciting happening. So plenty of water, plenty of wet paint. Follow that horizon, but that's what I'm trying to get. I want to get some of these sort of like marks happening just by pressing the brush kind of onto the paper, just so we're getting, and the sort of, let's see if we do it straight on. Yeah, it starts to sort of like run down. And of course, it's hitting that sort of band of dryness there. So I can then come in. I'm going to get my spray bottle and add a little bit more to it. Oh, that looks exciting, doesn't it? If you haven't got a spray bottle, you can actually just try getting a wet brush and flick some water at it. So let's try that as well, so we can see what that does. So you can just load your brush up with water and flick some water at the page, and just sort of like as if you're firing at some of these paint areas, and we're starting to get some sort of movement on the surface, some unpredictability going on, because what we're trying to do is create a background that we can then work into. So let's come in with some more pigment now. So, and the temptation is to kind of build it up in stripes. So, but what you tend to find with that is, if you with a more realistic painting, it might work, but I sometimes find that if you do that, you get rather a kind of Rupert the Bear scarf effect, and very sort of very stripy. So I'm just trying to put more like sort of patches of this sort of blue colour where I'm getting this rippling kind of colour coming in. I'm getting this sort of hopefully gives us a kind of feel of movement, and you can start introducing little hints of greeniness into the blue. If it goes too green, or you've picked up too much green in your brush, just come straight back over the top with some blue to sort of pump that blue colouring. So you just want to give it that kind of edge. So I'm starting to get, I'm liking these sort of divisions that this dripping has given me. So I want to keep those, I think, at the moment, because I think I may work those into the kind of upright form that I want to bring into this. So I'm going to take some of these colours along. Again, keep working. I sort of almost feel like you're pressing the brush against the surface and kind of pumping the water in and the paint in, so sort of like dabbing, rather than sort of drawing your brush, and then that gives you these sort of wells and inputs of colour that come across. And what I'm going to do is, once we've sort of got and once I'm happy with what's happening on this side, I'm going to give it a very quick blast with the hairdryer, and that's because then what I'm going to do is flip it over, and I want to create a sky in the similar kind of vein, but going the other way. So if I flip it over now, because I've got one set of drips in, they're going to disappear and they'll start changing direction, and I want to just get these dry quickly so that I can then turn it over and have drips going the other way, so we're getting almost like a mirroring kind of effect. So I'm just going to put a little bit more, so you can see I've got a big reservoir of paint here, so I just want to encourage that downwards. So I'm going to flood in a bit more of pigment above it, just pumping it into the sort of paper surface. Still not going. You're being stubborn this morning. It's got a bulge in the paper just underneath it, so it's there we go, that's gotcha. It was resting like a shelf, and we had to get to the point of sort of no return, where the pigment was going to be enough to kind of pull it over. So last bit here, and then I'm going to grab my hairdryer early on, just give it a quick, it may sound strange to think of the hairdryer as a painting tool, but I'm going to dry from this angle going down, so that the drips that are left are going to be pushed down that way, because I want this side all going that way. It's going to take about a minute to just dry that off, and then we're going to flip the board round, and we're going to kind of do the same thing but going other way. Okay, so I'm just going to grab my hairdryer. Again, if you don't have one, you could try lifting the surface off a bit with some, very, very carefully use some tissue just to sort of take out some of the moisture. If you just get a piece of tissue and just touch it on some of the dry points, and just so that you can sort of suck the moisture out. All we want to avoid is these ones rushing the wrong way right now. So I'm just going to do a quick 30-second blast. I'm just taking the edge off this water, that's all. I'm just going to mute for like 30 seconds. Right, so I'm back on. So I've just given it a really, really quick dry, and then just flipped it over. If you're working where you can work flatter, then you can sort of get round it. But I want to now try and get a similar kind of thing happening to these drips here. I don't know that by the magic of technology, we'll manage to make them match up, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. I want to get another sweep in here. Look in the colours that we've got going in the picture, because we do have that kind of, I was going to stick to all blues, but I think as we've got this very sort of golden beachy kind of feel, I'm going to repeat this, but I'm going to use now brown golden toned paint across here. So if you haven't got a spray bottle, just spray some water, or do a wash of paint of water onto that bit, but I'm just going to put a general spray of water on there, and then I'm going to get my big brush again, and just sort of, I want to keep this horizon line so it's a real point where these two things meet. So I'm just going to draw my brush along onto that wet surface, just with water. Well, it's got a bit of blue pigment in, but we'll forgive ourselves that. And you can see there's already some nice drips starting up. And so then we're going to come in with, I'm going to use this sort of ochre-y, browny kind of, you can just see my scruffy watercolours, just sort of that colour that is sort of ochre and those sort of sandy, earthy colours. And let's get a nice, hopefully get a nice streak of that golden colour coming through, and start getting some other ripples and some shapes happening onto that background. So I can just bring that down. So we're starting to get some drips happening on the edges too, and then maybe take another sweep of paint, just focusing on the middle a little bit more, just getting some more pigment onto there. Some extra kind of darkness into the colours there, and then again I'm going to come back and I'm going to sort of pump again with this sort of, I'm going to add some slightly darker browns in too, but I'm going to sort of pump in again just to sort of bring, so as long as I'm working below that horizon line, and let's see what we can get shape wise kind of happening here. So there's some really interesting things starting to burnish out. I'd like to get some drips to happen as well, because I want to slightly mimic the shapes that are happening above. So again, just start pumping some water and some pigment into that space, just pressing the brush on like that, and it's come out quite differently, and that's brilliant because we've now got something different happening here, and you've got these sense of two different surfaces. So let's keep going. Let's move the brush along and just sort of pushing it against the surface, so it's really that just the fall through the water, and it's sort of doing its thing that it wants to do. I've got quite an area of blue here, so have a look at the areas where you've got and see if you can. I want to mimic this a little bit here, so perhaps just expand that space so it's slightly doing the same thing as the one above, and then I want to get it to drip, so I can push again some water into that. My drips are coming out different shapes on this side because it's sort of like this is bowed out, so it's got like a sort of bow in this area, which again is slowing the progress down, but I'm quite happy with that because I want it to sort of give me things to sort of challenge me almost. And it's funny how just using those two colours you really start seeing that as kind of sea and beach, even though they've got all these weird streamers of stuff happening. I'm going to go in with the darker and more like a sort of sienna kind of colour in top of that as well. If you think the colour gets too heavy at any point, if you're not happy with it, then I'm going to come in with some water and again push that through the pigment so it softens it and it blends it, and it will always dry lighter than where we started, but just being aware of that horizon line, not encroaching above it into the blue space, and that's just sort of bringing some shadow and some darkness in, and that's getting quite exciting. I think I want to bring some of that colour through into here as well, so I can just get that more intense. I'm going to put quite a big slice in, just a more intense line across that horizon, and then again get some water. I don't want that to be stripy, I don't want a stripy sort of blob in there, so again just push the water into it and let that gravity pull into this, pull down and sort of start creating these sort of interesting rivulets of things that are happening. And I love doing this technique because you can play with the sort of expectations of gravity so much. You can do this, dry it all off, and then you can swap it around in different positions. So, you know, you can already see these that were coming down are now sort of splurging up into the sort of atmosphere. And you could even put this sort of sideways again, so you've got like a spine almost heading out in both directions. It's a really interesting way of giving yourself a starting point. So just adding a little bit more water into that side. I want to get quite a good tonal coverage on this side. I want more white up here because because the sea and the sky has so much more luminescence to it, and we're sort of, you know, referencing those things. So I'm going to take some areas in between these white areas and get some paint a bit sort of lower down, so it's not all coming from the horizon, and again get a little well of paint and then whoosh some water through it to kind of get that to run. And you can build like a really fantastically abstract base like that using the colours from your environment, and then you can go back in and kind of anchor it with much more realistic and representational shapes, and this just sort of becomes, but hopefully this will give you like a sense of light and space that you want to work on. If you start initially just seeing these things broken down into huge, just the most simplest areas, you know, the most sort of like, you know, most sea pictures you basically have a stripe of blue and a stripe of gold, and if you start off with those sort of seeing those as just two areas on their own right, and then we can start sort of focusing in on details and building up different sort of textures, but you can have so much fun getting these sort of bases in, and this is going to give us lots of things to work on. So I'm quite happy again with this. Now with the sort of trees marching off into the horizon, I do want to put those on in paint initially, but again I don't want to put them onto a really sopping wet background because then they're going to really spread. They're going to interfere with the colours that are going here too much. So again I'm going to grab a hairdryer. If you don't have a hairdryer, put it in the sun for just a few minutes and it will start to dry off. Or again, get a piece of tissue and just very, very gently lift some of the dampness out of the surface. Even if you're really stuck without one, if you can bear having it on the oven at the lowest setting, you can pop it in for a couple of minutes and it will just dry up. So again, I'm going to grab my hairdryer and just take the moisture off here, and then we're going to use a square brush or the biggest brush you've got to kind of put in some dramatic, these sort of slices of tree bark, kind of wooden soldiers, I keep thinking of them as. So again, I'm going to mute and I'm going to just do like a minute of drying again. Right, so that's dried off my surface enough to then, so that when I put the next sort of, these sort of, let's have a quick, I'm going to just pop this on. This is what we're sort of looking at, is these sort of marching wooden broken timbers going off into the sea like that. So I'm going to just start mapping some of those, and I can use dark colour, and hopefully they're not going to get completely, they're not going to muck up what's on beforehand, and we're going to work with it. So I'm going to use my big square brush again, because I always seem to paint everything with a big square brush. But of course, for these kind of like very dramatic shapes, they're going to be really useful to sort of get that sort of square edge feel. With these sort of lines I've got here, I'm going to slightly kind of take them into account when I'm painting. So I'm going to come up and kind of follow some of these shapes here. I'm going to exaggerate the perspective a bit, as it were, on some of these to get some real drama into the piece. So I'm mixing up some very, very dark chocolate brown and some black, because although I always say don't use too much black, don't use black when to create shadows. But if you've got black things in your painting, obviously you can use black absolutely fine. So I'm not going to do anything, I'm not going to do loads. I'm going to take some vertical through this and just see kind of how they grow and how they appear. The biggest one is going to be on this left hand side, because we tend to see progression, you know, one side or the other kind of going that way, and so that's going to be quite a big bold one in here. We're going to do work on these to kind of give them texture. I quite like some of the other shapes that are appearing in some of the other ones, so you can do any kind of shapes you like, really, marching off into almost as they're sort of soldiers on a sort of like fool's mission into the water. There's almost a slightly sort of King Canute-ish feel about this, or this sort of slightly mythic quality of them going off to fight the sea in some way, and the sea kind of, and I've got this nice space of white through here and that line there, so I'm going to follow that. You can do them quite thin to begin with. You can decide to go back in and do more later, because you can just sort of see how you're getting that progression. And on the dry paper it tends to be harder to get the paint to come out, so you can do a couple of strokes going up, and if you want to change the dimension of your stroke, you just start off with the wide brush and then twist it against the paper, and that pulls it onto the edge, and that gives you quite a nice fluid kind of change from one to the other. As we go towards the right, they're going to become shorter and thinner, and I'm still going to follow a little bit, just referencing where those blue lines come, just kind of coming through. And we can always go back and darken them later, but we're just kind of thinking about how we want them to go. And obviously I've exaggerated their sort of height and depth, and they're really starting to come smaller, and just bring them slightly closer together, and we're starting to get that feel of perspective kind of marching through this sort of landscape. And then are they going to go into the sea? Yeah, mine are going to go into the sea. I think they're going to come, if you know, just get a few little tiny marks of them coming into that sort of moment there, and I can make them a bit more sort of broken and a bit more kind of strange tree-like, so they're going to lap together, and we can add some texture onto these to kind of enhance their sculptural kind of feel. And bring those through, and I quite like, there's one on one of the pictures that's quite a flat one, but it's got this sort of white space in between, sort of like a gap, and I quite like that one, so I'm going to slightly try and create something that's similar in feel. So it's got a chink of light kind of coming through it in some sort of way, and I seem to have accidentally on that one as well, so let's keep those two together. And I'm going to go back and I want to darken up the surface of these. And my brush has got a split in it, which is not permanent, it's just happened. And I sometimes really love it when that happens, because you can kind of bring, just naturally leaves that sort of little bit of texture and kind of light coming through. And so what we're trying to do is pull out all the time, we're trying to pull out the kind of essence of the image, the sort of image, that the part of it that's really attracted us in the first place, but without worrying about being too literal about it. So it's sort of finding areas that we can then go on and explore and that we can make into our own kind of piece. And that's why abstraction is such a fantastic sort of thing to play with, because, you know, it can't go wrong. There's no bits that, you know, that aren't there, because it's all doing its thing. It's doing what it wants to do. And no one can come along and tell you've got it wrong. It's brilliant. And yet people can see they can see so much into what you're putting on. Now I'm thinking about possibly adding some shadow, because on these sort of sea environments you have these very kind of stark shadows. You have very, very intense light. So on the original source photos, of course, the shadows are all kind of at 12 o'clock, which means they're all kind of just underneath. And I don't want to just paint like a sort of, it would look like a sort of black line all the way along there if we just put like a 12 o'clock sort of shadow. So I'm going to try just flicking a little bit of, I'm going to water it down at first, just bringing a hint of that across, just like to get a little hint of shadow into the bottom of those, and then I can I've just got long, I'm just pulling, yes, I'm using the end of the square brush just to kind of flick them across, and then where I've got them going into the water, I'm going to get myself a very dark kind of blue and just continue that sense of shadow into the kind of water kind of area, but just by kind of giving it a little ripple. So it's just a little hint of shadow onto that. I don't put too much. If I put too dark, it might get, it'll become too sort of representational, but I just quite like. And I think what we can do is get some texture into this sort of sand area. Again, sort of like some spiralling sort of texture. But we've sort of come to the end of the painting bit now. I think for me, that's where I'm going to stop. If you've got a fantastic painting that you think is, really working as a painting, you can always basically sort of keep on working as a painting. But I'm going to add, and what I want to do is add some texture sort of elements into these sort of vertical pieces along here, and then possibly into the beach area too. What I'd like to do is I'll be using dark pens or black pens on the sort of timber, but then I've got some sepia and brown pens, so I'm going to keep the pen work to its background colour, so that I'm not going to be using too much black on this area. And then we'll see what's going to happen up here, but we'll keep working on it. Right, so again, I'm just going to give it a very brief 30-second dry, because it's only just these sort of posts that are wet, but I'm just going to do that quickly, and then we'll start looking at some of the texture and the pen shapes on these dark surfaces. So I'm just going to mute again quickly. Right, so that's all mine needs, just to make sure that it's dry, and you might well find that yours is pretty much dry now anyway, because we're dealing with such a hot day. Now, when we look at if you look at the original kind of one quickly again on the photograph, if I bring it forward so you can sort of see what I'm talking about, you'll notice that again, in line with the sort of light that you get, this edge of like this tall standing stalagmite here is almost completely jet black, but when I get to this side, there's a lot more texture and a lot more shade and detail revealed. So what I'm going to do, not to sort of copy that directly, but to kind of reference it, is I'm going to outline. Often what we do is outline some of the shapes that the painting has given us, and I'm going to do that again, but only on this one side, the side where the shadow is going. So it will automatically make this side of our form slightly lighter. So I've got a 0.4 pen. Again, I try and start kind of in the middle range of widths, because then you've got somewhere to go either side. So I'm just going to pick out the painted edge of that shape kind of coming down. And with the black, it's going to make it very, very stark, but we're going to keep on building the texture on these pieces across this surface to kind of really give it that timbered kind of feel, or to even go beyond that and give it a very sort of different craggy kind of feel. But I'm just following, and just let your pen follow what the paint has done, because we're trying to make a reality out of what we have on the page now. So we're sort of moving further and further away from anything representational, and we're just seeing what the paint has given us to work with. With this one, with the split, I'm going to do this side. So again, the right hand side of this hollow, because that would sort of be picking up more shadow than highlight as well. So again, just following, and if the paper's bobbled, if it's got a nice little furry edge, we're going to follow that too, take that down into that kind of hollow, and then I'm going to come on this side, and yeah, I can see some lovely little bobbles and spreads just happening, and just a little the sort of texture that the paper's given me. So I can follow that and get that cut out against the light of the water behind. And if you just get a really broken up area, you can decide where you're going to sort of almost join the dots and kind of go round it and follow it down. But just let your paint tell you where it's, show you where it's gone. Just see where it's gone and go with that. See, I've got a bit that's sticking out, almost like a hook there. So I'm going to incorporate that so it becomes really textural. And we're going to build texture and surface up onto these dark forms, so they become quite strong and monolithic in the environment. When I come down to this one on the bottom here, I'm going to find that sort of bottom edge, take it a little way along, and then just kind of let it fade out just by lifting the pen off the surface. So it's sort of starting to disappear off towards that edge. And then again, same on this one. I'm going to come a little bit closer so we can hopefully see that edge that I'm getting in there. And again, with this one, because it's got a split in it as well, so it's going to be, oh, I've just gone slightly off. We just tilt up a little tiny bit. There we go. So it's going to be this edge, deciding what I want with this edge, and falling that down, drawing that down, just following all those little ins and outs and round, and then again on this side. We may come back and do more, but for now let's just get all these edges in. Try and think of this sort of stark contrast, and the darker we get these timbered sections, the brighter the background is going to look, and the more you're going to get that sense of that incredible light that you get on the beach on a summer's day, that real stark contrast between the two. So it's that old sort of adage of, if you can't make something in your picture brighter because it's already white paper, you make what's around it darker and darker, and then you're also sort of turning up the volume on the light at the same time. So as you're drawing the edge of these posts in, you're not only making them darker, but the sea and the sort of sand in comparison starts to look brighter and lighter, and it has this more reflective light quality. So let me just get this last, and as they disappear off into the water, or however many you've got growing up there, just follow that line, because the further away they are, the less detail you're going to see. So it's quite a useful trick when you're using these sort of pens. You can use the we use the thicker pens actually on the further away pieces, so that you get more darkness on them, and then they become less detailed and more kind of shadowy, because I can just very quickly, almost just a few lines, just fill in those dark ones and really give them some punch. And then the lighter pen, the thinner pens, you keep for the detail on the closer ones, because you're going to see more fine detail when something is closer to you. And so that immediately helps to get a sense of perspective into the shape. So I'm starting on these back ones to just enhance the I'm not colouring them in. I'm actually doing sort of like wobbly lines, kind of wiggly lines going down, but they're just very close together. And because I'm using, let's see if I can pick it up if I come in closer, because I'm using a thicker, a 0.4 pen, and they're quite small shapes, they fill up really quickly. So I'm just running a vertical, but it's wobbly. It's following the paint lines that are there. It's coming across the form, and then it's sort of petering out towards the edge, so it's not going to go all the way across the edge, and it's still leaving a tiny bit of light on one side, and it's hopefully making those look much stronger. When I get to this one, again, I'm just running a line down, just wobbling, just following little deviations in the paint, little edges of lightness. And I can see I've got like a long slit in this one, so I can go round that and bring that up just to leave that little bubble of light in there, and then continue. But I'm just thinking of like bark textures, so running some lines vertically down, but they're wobbly lines, they're going in and out on that, they're sort of playing with the texture of the paper, and as long as they're basically doing the vertical thing, they're going to give that feeling of tall, long, statuesque kind of shapes. But by not being straight lines, but by being sort of jagged and wibbly, they're starting to give that bark-like texture. So I'm keeping them close together. On the edge where you want more darkness, you might want to put an extra one in, so it's the closer together you draw your lines, the more darkness they bring. So on this right hand edge, I've got them packed quite close together. So if I can get even closer, you might just see that. You can see how they're just packed really tightly together, almost coloured in on that far edge. But as they come across this way, I'm letting more of the background appear. So I'm spacing them out. I'm giving them some more air, as it were. And that is automatically creating that sense of shadow, because you've got the darker edge on this side and a lighter edge on this side, and we're getting that feeling of sort of both texture and form. So let's go on to this one here. So with this one, again, I'm just going to put a strong line very, very close to the outline that I've already drawn. But just if the paper throws it off a tiny bit, that doesn't matter, because I just want to create like a rippley effect. But I'm keeping it really close to that right hand outline line. And then in the next one, I just try and make it fractionally further apart. Maybe decide to kind of deviate, or I can see a little paint line there of sort of edge of shadow, so I'm going to follow that line, open it out, let it open out a little bit, and I'm just putting these little wells of paint sort of showing through, these long slices of paint. Then maybe I'll throw in, this one's going to become a little bit tighter again, just to bring in an edge of shadow onto that surface. But we're going to keep these lines lovely and wobbly and wiggly and jaggedy. They're not in any way going to be straight and sort of architectural. They're going to be soft, and where you bring them closer together, if you sort of bring the wobbles to touch, they form a little pool of darkness, and you can spread them out, you can open them out again, and they give you texture and they give you different sort of light. Now I've come to this sort of second spot. You may not have this on yours, but you might have something similar. So again, because this is going to be quite a hard edge, that top one I'm going to do a line very close to it before I let it I'm sort of following the bubbles and the wobbles that have come before me, kind of trying to mimic them, but in a way, because you can't mimic them, it still gives this quite sort of interesting sort of texture. And then I can spread again, so I want to leave a little bit of space before I do the next one, and come down and bring that edge down. Now I may stop at this point and just leave that line, that sort of edge, and not use, and so to do that last bit, oh sorry, I just hit my light, that's come on more than I was expecting. Might be a bit too bright, I think. No, maybe it does need to be a little bit on. Is that better? Yeah, that's better. So I've done all this bit here in the 0.4 pen, so I'm going to switch then to a slightly smaller pen, so a 0.2 or a 0.1, going down the scale. Where is my 0.2? Why is it always the one that you want to pick up? It's the one that is hiding from you. Always, you tricky. Yes, just because it knows, it's just snuck away from me. I was using it, like, just before it started, because, I'm going to do a load of drawing today, so the first thing I do in the morning to relax is some drawing. No, I can find all my tiny pens. All right, I'm going to use a 0.3 because I've got him. So again, I'm just going to do these last ones in a slightly thinner line, and that automatically is going to make them slightly less impactful and more subtle. So if I do a 0.3 sort of along there, and then I can switch to a 0.1, who was here a second ago. Here you are. You're here. Well done. And then I can just take some of those fine line, and if it doesn't always come out crisp, it just adds to that kind of feeling of texture. So that helps me to give some definition to this edge, but by using the thinner pen, it automatically controls how much you can get onto the paper. So it gives you a lovely gradation of tone. If I go back to this one behind, I can just put on a few lines with the lighter pen, again the thinner pen, and that's giving me texture, but it's not overloading the surface, so we still get that differentiation going across the sort of surface. So again, hopefully you're seeing this is really the simplest marks you can make, really, but it's just thinking about how close together to put them. So you're not really worrying about the shape of your line, you're just getting lines kind of coming in. So moving back into the larger pieces here, so we can follow, and you can see I've got some nice ripples in the paint that I can follow. I might want to, I can see like a really strong edge there, and now these are getting a bit closer, I've got more room to kind of think about some pattern and sort of some form into some of these wiggles, but we can bring them round and maybe sort of like, you know, find like a little shape. Look, that's got like a sort of foot on it now, it's come down and do a sort of ripple, almost like a little flat area. So when I do another one, I can bring it down and maybe follow that. So look, it's just coming round and echoing that shape just to draw the attention to it, and then bring these up into these areas. Maybe where I've got a little bubble like that in the surface, I might go the other way and leave it like a little knot hole in that surface. So as I get a bit closer to the camera, as it were, I can start, and I've got the hang of doing these verticals. You can sort of like say, right, okay, so I'm going to slightly experiment, because now that I'm getting closer to my viewer, they're going to see some of these little details that I can throw in. So, and that starts to all add to this sort of texture. At the moment I'm still on the 0.4 pen, but I'm going to go lighter in a minute. So look, I've just thrown some little circles in onto that just to change that round, and I can echo that circle to kind of give that wood grain feel. And here we can get, we're still sort of working vertically, but just few more kind of spirals, kind of waves coming down like that. So we're getting some slightly more interesting shapes happening. And then I can swap over to my lighter pen, because this side is kind of getting more sunlight. So I can, let me just tilt up a tiny bit because we're missing the top. There we go. I can still use some pattern lines to draw down. This 0.1's a bit reluctant today, it's obviously feeling the heat, but they're going to be lighter, they're going to be thinner, and I can start throwing some different shapes into that surface. Like, we start getting some spiral knots kind of happening, and some up and down curly shapes. And see here, I can just bring, like, if it just sort of echo some lines coming around into a kind of curl, you get a nice sort of little burst of sort of surface like that, and you get this lovely sort of gnarling kind of effect. So we can start getting whirls and like almost like fingerprints appearing, and then you think, well, I've got a circle there, so I can bring my lines working around that circle, almost in the way that water flows around stone. So if you do a circle into your wood surface, and then you can start to get the lines to kind of pull around. And at this scale at the moment, if they don't work out brilliantly, you can just keep adding a few more in, and you can kind of disappear any mistakes, and there are no mistakes anyway. So then down the bottom here, I'm just pulling some lines round that to kind of make that sort of bulbous foot on the bottom. And you can almost start seeing this a bit like, these become almost like sort of carved totem poles. You know, you could imagine them being part of some sort of there is a very a famous, there's beach henge, which I think is up on the northeast coast, which is wood standing like this, but it's wood that was put there about the same time as Stonehenge was built. So there's these incredible sort of wooden timbers, some of which are still seen above the water, and they are part of some sort of Neolithic religious site, or we assume religious, or at least site of gathering and sort of worship in some way. And it's called Woodhenge, and it's amazing to think that these were trees that were growing sort of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and they're still there on the beach. Right, so we're going to come on to this one here. Now again, we're getting closer, so now we can really think about how some of our patterns are going to work on here. So back to the 0.4 pen. So why I'm mentioning Woodhenge is they kind of, these are starting to have this feel to me that they almost look like they could be carved ancient monuments. I'm going to bring this line in thicker here because I'm imagining that this front section here would cast a bit more shadow onto this side. So I think it's okay to sort of make that line a bit firmer. And then these lines are going to come twisting down. This side's going to be quite packed together and giving again a build up of tone, and then I can throw in a sort of couple of circles, and then I can bring my lines round those circles, and they're sort of flowing around and in between, sort of drawing that line down. And then I can see I've got quite a strong edge here, and that's all just in paint line, so I'm going to go with that line and make that into like another fold in the wood sort of surface, and then I'm going to pack some lines quite tight together in this section because I want it to be darker. I want it to have its sort of depth in that sort of carved area, and then I can fill those in, and let's put some swirliness happening. So that has become quite a sort of dark area on that, but I'm hoping you can start to see all those lines kind of swirling and merging together and sort of creating texture. So to keep this side looking lighter, I'm going to go into a thinner pen again. And get some of these sort of... Now I can do some really nice patterns. There's a big space here, so we can sort of... I can see a lovely area of paint there that I can identify and sort of draw around, and I can draw this sort of edge, and you know, maybe I can add some smaller details. I've got some sort of paint spray, so maybe this one is going to start to have some broken kind of edge work around it, just sort of pulling those out and coming up the surface and working around all these areas and moving, just creating these moments of sort of pattern. And I can start building in, so like where this area is, like I've got this little spray that I've sort of drawn around, so I can turn that into almost like a little branch of shapes, these long sort of teardrop shapes that can sort of work in together and become a bit more kind of floral looking. So you start throwing in moments of actual pattern, you know, that can look quite surreal, and then these start to look more like, they start thinking, oh, is this carving, or is it all natural forms, or is there someone getting involved with these and adding their own graffiti? So I can bring some of these little hints of pattern in, and then continue the kind of wood bark effect going through. So it's just playing with the surface. You know, you could even write, you know, there is something wonderful about discovering ancient graffiti on things, this thought that people have been here and they've wanted to leave their mark. I went to I'm just going to work pattern onto this while I'm talking. I'm just trying different patterns and then seeing how they kind of all fit, and then bringing these verticals running through it. For our honeymoon we went to Sri Lanka, and we visited this incredible temple which is built on a rock, and it's like in the way that Ayers Rock is a giant rock. This is called Sigiriya Rock, and it is just a huge boulder about the size of, well, it's like a small town upended, this sort of boulder, and it has this incredible palace carved all the way through it, and it had water systems like that ran on gravity that allowed them to pump water all the way up to this enormous palace at the top where the ruler sat. And at the bottom of this sort of palace is this incredible area of a giant swimming pool. It was a giant swimming pool. And he apparently used to sit on a throne in front of this swimming pool, and all his hundreds of wives would swim in this pool. And and all the walls are covered in drawings of all these wives with sort of, and it was obvious from the drawings that he had quite a wide reaching, he was obviously very on the equivalent of Tinder or whatever, in this it's about 800 BC. It's amazing. It's an incredibly sophisticated palace that is not that well known over here, and so he clearly had wives from a whole range of countries, including obviously far down in Africa, but also ladies with very red hair, which they have assumed have actually come from, some Celtic, stock. So he had a very wide-ranging taste. And the thing was, you could apparently pay to come and watch his wives swimming in the pool. I imagine they were fairly scantily clad. And why I'm talking about it is that there's all this graffiti in the caves around where people obviously have been, and they've written down which one they like best, and sort of, and it's sort of like a fan site, they've sort of like, written poetry and professed, this sort of love for these women that they obviously can't, get anywhere near. But it was sort of quite, it was weirdly like sort of Instagram, but in stone, and about 1800 years ago. It was quite fascinating. You can see it sort of stayed with me. But there's all these different languages of people that had obviously travelled, and you never think about people travelling because Sri Lanka is it's an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, so people had obviously come from all sorts of different places to. And I sort of wondered, did they organise day trips? Was there like a sort of, a coach trip equivalent, where you could go and see these, these ladies swimming in the water? But, quite incredible. But it's just wonderful seeing all these lovely comments of, people from thousands, hundreds of years ago, having left their little scratched messages on these stones, some in Latin, some in Greek, some in Sanskrit, And I sort of feel it's such a human impulse to want to leave your mark on, and sort of like it's a real fundamental art statement, I think, to sort of come in and want to somehow scratch, I was here in some sort of way. And so this is what I'm thinking about in these sort of pillars. They're becoming sort of quite. You can see if I zoom on this one a bit, maybe turn the light a little bit, you can see hopefully some of these patterns building up, and they're sort of working with the surface. So I'm drawing, again, still finding areas in the paint to kind of to go round and draw around, and then where I've got a nice edge like that, I can sort of put in a couple of circles and a spiral, just very simple snail spirals, and maybe some sort of long teardrop shapes. And then my timber can continue to grow round these sort of bits, and they become, quite like sort of totem poles. So you get the feeling that someone has come along and carved into them and tried to make sense of what they're doing there. And you can just keep on building it. And of course, as we get closer to the ones on the front, we can add even more intricate designs and shapes. And you might get, we might get some, you could do carvings based on sort of sea creatures. But by using this black line, you're starting to kind of get this lovely texture in. And then again, if you want to get something a bit more shady, you just bring more lines in close together and bring them down to the same sort of point. And then that will start to darken some of these sort of areas. I'm just going to come onto the top half of this one. So because it's quite pale, we can start to see really, we've got a lovely space here for adding our designs and sort of texture on. So initially, I imagine everyone was thinking, this is quite a simple one. This is going to take, this is going to do this in one session. This is just going to be, but you can see how actually we can start really working into this and bringing an awful lot of a lovely lot of detail, and sort of, and then you think, I can do some lines like this, like just sort of slightly gentle diagonal ones. That gives me again another surface, and then some of those can go into a spirally curl and go up into teardrop shapes that just fill into the sort of space that we're going. So again, we're just seeing all the little areas of what's happening up here, and then seeing if we can define a little space for ourselves, and then see how our lines can work around with it. So if you get a little splat in the paper, that's lovely. You can draw around that, and then then see what shape that's given you to work with. And we can, as a circle there, look like I'm just doing some rays coming out of it, and then they're going to come tumbling down into the lower section, like flowing down. And because we're sort of still working in this sort of like top to bottom vertical sense, you've got this feeling of them flowing, and it starts to pick up on the idea of water as well. So they do relate to their sort of surroundings. And we can, of course, completely go into, once you've got these sort of black lines, we can go into more of them and getting more of them onto this sort of surface. And we can use some lighter pens and some colours in to highlight, because once we've got this sort of black work done in, what I'm going to do, by the way, is I'm going to leave these two for a minute. I'm going to put some white work onto this one to show you how you can bring that up. And then I'm going to look at maybe what we might do, whether we're going to do anything on this surface or not. I haven't decided yet, but I'm going to just bring a little bit of white pen onto here. If I can, here we go, here's my favourite one. And I'm thinking again about imagining, because now we're going to think about the way the sunlight is hitting it and the way the highlights would work. So just on like the sort of, again, keeping it more on the kind of, you keep it more on the left hand side, just to add little flicks of white into the shapes that you've drawn. And that starts to bring little moments of light just coming into the shapes that you've drawn on. So it sort of starts to pick up on the patterns that are there. Probably less on this side, but again, as you're coming down, just look at some of the lines that you've put in and just put a little bit of white going in the same direction, just in the space between them, really. And that starts to really pick out these sort of carved details that we've created that, you know, we didn't know were here until we started drawing them. And so I've got little dots there, so I can bring those dots around, and they're going to give this sort of, going to add just this little extra layer of kind of highlight and texture. And you see, it's sort of, when you've got the structure there of all that sort of black work, it's so much easier to go in and say, right, well, there's a little circle here, so I just put a little dab of white onto that just to bring it up and give it a highlight. And so you're working with the shapes that you've drawn by pulling them out of the surface of the paper. So although there is obviously just conscious decision that you're not having to worry about what to do, because you're still just looking at, you've looked at the paint to kind of follow the black work, and then you've put a few patterns in to kind of throw the lines around and make them do something, and then you see what you've got, and you can just go back and add some little moments of white pen to start bringing those out and making them into real features. And then we're starting to get that sort of the sense of light, the sense of sunlight. And, you know, if you were doing a more naturalistic version, you could just simply follow some of the texture that you've drawn in of the bark and just add little bits of highlight along in there. So I'm just coming up and maybe up into this top surface. Because even where the paint is getting quite faint, you can see the light kind of working through it. And then I can put some of these just on these swirl lines. Just up through here. And that's, you know, the way that you can just build more sort of texture into this sort of surface that you've created and start giving it a lot more weight and solidity by, now that you've got the sort of shadow in, you can bring, so even on this one where it's starting to come smaller, as you go back you're going to see less of this detail again, but you can still add in a few little moments. You don't have to do very accurate, it's not doing very complicated lines, it's just little dots and flicks of white onto the surface. Just choose a little area, you can just put a little dot, a little line, and that just, keeping it on the side that's more lit up will help make sense of the form, so it doesn't look it still keeps the form of the shape going. So you can see how I've got the white highlights on this side, so where the sunlight is hitting, and then there's no highlights on this side where it's all in shadow, and it starts to really give that an intense, it gives it a 3D feel, puts it in its landscape. And then again on these ones, as they disappear off, I can just put tiny little hints of light and moments through, just to kind of add as if the wood is kind of creating a little sort of sparkle like that. So that's what I think I will go on to do, is to sort of oh no, I've dropped the lid. I'll have to get that later. But it's that one thing. Oh no, not in this weather, because they'll dry up in seconds. Bless them. so I've got this sort of light kind of like coming into them. So I've got to think, am I going to put any sort of texture into the surface along here? So I'm not going to use black pens because I think it'd be too heavy, and I want to keep this kind of stark sense of monoliths and sort of sculptures kind of moving across into this world. So I've got some sepia or some brown pens. Any kind of like sandy kind of colour I think will work quite nicely on this. This set I've got a range of sizes. So it's quite daunting because I quite like this where we are now, but I think I do want to put some. So again, I'm just going to start by gently following. Can you gently follow? Just subtly following maybe some of the paint bands that I've got in, and with these lines I'm going to keep them again, just sort of looking at the paint that's there, and here I can see a kind of like a sort of stony quality because it's got sort of broken blobs, so I can kind of draw around those and they become like sort of stonework, and so I won't stonework, I mean they become pebbles, you know, like sort of falling down. And then you've got these sort of rivulets, and I think it's just nice to build up, I think it is working to build up some texture, just to follow these sort of shapes. And you might take them off into, you know, really quite different directions. You know, we might get all sorts of things happening here. So let's not be nervous. Let's be bold and just sort of see where they're going to take us. And then, like with these sort of areas where they're sort of like the trickles are coming down, I'm sort of ignoring the shadows as if the shadows aren't there, because the shadows just go over the surface that's there. They don't sort of, I don't want to draw around them yet because they're going to stay. I might just keep them as just the sort of paint marks on the surface. But again, I can build up some line work around these sort of areas, and it just starts creating texture. And I can I'm sort of wanting to try and keep my lines favouring the horizontal on here, because it's the land as opposed to the very upright nature of the towers. So I can bring not going to massively, but just maybe just sort of take a more horizontal approach to these things as they move across. Although these are all drips going down, which I appreciate are therefore not horizontal, I'm sort of just trying to think of the layering. And so if I want to add anything extra in, I'm going to do them going along the horizontal if I can, just to sort of see if I can get keep that feel of landscape moving across. And yeah, I think there's potential. And I think when you're doing these and you want to sort of set them again in the landscape, try and get your lines to kind of follow along and then kind of stop and then reappear on the other side, and that will really help with the perspective of kind of rooting them where they're sort of standing, just sort of bringing them into that sort of surface. What to do with this horizon edge? Do I want to make that firmer? Do I want to give it? Yeah, I think I'm going to just come in, and that's because that's a moment where land is meeting sea. So let's bring that through there. And I could, if I wanted to, think about doing wave patterns into that blue. I'm going to leave the blue at the moment because I think I quite like it being soft and being sort of hard to, you know, I don't want it to, because it is a different surface. It's got to look sort of liquid and moving. So I'm going to just keep working these sort of, they're just wobbly lines really, or just sort of wiggly lines, but you know, just through this sort of surface. And then where I've got this white here, maybe I can bring some wobbly lines sort of through there. Some of them can form into circles and patterns. So it's not far off what I've been doing on the uprights, but it's just sort of thinking, as I said, favouring the horizontal over the vertical for here, so I can start building up this sort of surface of stones. And like all these things, I always think, oh, if you're worrying, have I done enough, then it's probably a key that you need to do twice as much. If I think, well, have I done too much? No, keep going, because it's the more you're kind of adding this sort of surface in, the more you're saying, look at all these paint marks, look at this, you know, what we're creating here. And I quite like on this sort of sand as well. This is quite a good colour to put metallics onto. There's something about gold on top of metallic gold on top of painted gold I really quite like. So you start to get some sort of light, and you can. I think this one's going to work brilliantly. I have got a finer gold one, but I know I won't be able to find it because I'm, you know, when you just think I'll just pick that up, and it's this one's a bit messy. I'll find a different one. No, all right, I'll go with the messy one. Right, so if you've got quite a thick one, but you can just bring some sort of hints of dotted lines or stone tops and things kind of coming through in that sort of metallic, which, you know, might be better when the light hits it. I'm sure I can get my metallic pen that I like. Where's that hiding? Yeah, I've got a lovely pack of like gel pens, and they literally were from a pound shop, I think. Here we go, and they're all kind of like glitter gel pens, and they're really fun to use, and they add a whole different sort of sparkling dimension to what you're working on. And so I'm just using this sort of gold again, just working it across the surface, finding my patterns, finding my way through, just to build layers of sort of beachy sort of surface, thinking of seaweeds and tides. And as we come down into the sort of foreground area, our shapes can get bigger, because again we're going to see things in close-up more. So I might sort of create like a stone kind of shape there, and then that might need some line work in to give it a kind of harder edge, so I can just use that almost like a conventional shading, but just to kind of bring that sort of surface in. Let me come down on that a bit so you can see. So I'm leaving like a face of the rock, kind of. I'm imagining that there are rocks here, leaving one face of it kind of exposed and just painting, and then using my line work to come in and give that kind of a shadow. So where I've got these sort of like big area here, maybe I can draw and define around that, and that's going to become rocks as well. And I can put a shape under to echo it. And then again I can start doing some shading lines. It's just putting lines closer together, and again the tighter you get them, the more like shadow they're going to appear. And by using quite straight lines, it gives the rocks a very hard edge compared to the sort of texture of the wood. The wood's not exactly soft, but it doesn't have that flinty kind of quality that stones have. So if you just keep your line work quite straight on things like that, a sort of like abstract rockiness, then it sort of helps to give them their sort of quality. So again, I just done a shape, just do a sort of line to define an edge, and then bring some vertical lines in to kind of be shading. And once I've got those in, I can use other colour pens to come in and go in between those lines to add more depth and sort of character. And just bring... So I'm just going in between the lines that I drew first, just to add more with a sort of sepia pen, just to sort of create a different surface. But we're moving, you can see we're just sort of, so there is texture here, but I quite like the way it's also sort of like slightly hollow and floating, like it's again not 100% there. It's sort of a mysterious, and let's bring some of these other colours into this surface. So I don't know, I think I'm definitely going to continue onto the totem poles and sort of get some more detail onto there, and I'm going to keep building up the surfaces. And I want to keep this background almost untouched, because I think it's just got this lovely soft kind of billowing quality to it, and it makes a really lovely contrast in this sort of fantastical landscape that we've created. And I can still start getting some patterns in here. If I want to, I can start adding things that look like giant seashells. So we've got sort of spirals coming in. And then if I want to make those look more spirally, think about the way that they go. They're going to have curled lines sort of layering round. And see, just by using a curved line instead of using a straight line, that starts to make that look like a sort of giant animite kind of fossil or something. And just going round and round and round, just keeping my lines curved, and it helps to sort of describe that sort of surface. And remember how we can almost imagine that the sea urchins that we were drawing last time are sort of lurking on this beach. So we could sort of then go in and do, remember how we put little wells of like very dark shadow into them? So we can build up some corners around this surface that we're creating by just putting some really intense pen lines like that in, and then they start to pop out, and we're getting these sort of shadowed areas, just like as if the sea urchins were. So we've kind of managed to connect them really quite nicely to the drawing before, really. We've obviously got quite a lot of beach theme kind of feel coming through. So where I've got this sort of texture, I can go in and go round these shapes again with the darker brown pens. If we're keeping it in brown, then although it's adding shadow, it's not going to overpower the sort of the delicacy of this stony background, and it's not going to compete with the sort of big monuments on the side. It's going to do its own thing and be sort of in its own nature, but so we can sort of build up and we can keep moving round. So we've only got about 5 or so minutes to go before we're going to have to stop our session. But is there anything people want while they've got, want me to sort of move on to? Maybe let's look at some of this sort of where I've got the sort of really close up ones. How am I going to do these kind of monoliths here? Well, I think it's going to be more of the same but bigger, as it were. So where's my point? Why are you all rushing off? There you go. So just with this sort of one here at the end, or this sort of larger one, again where I've got this sort of split that I've put in here, I'm going to define that and make that sort of really strong. So I'm going to make this side darker and keep this side lighter, but I want them to sort of come. I can see I've got a really strong edge of paint that I can follow to begin with, to know where to start, and just come down through there and working that through and down onto that edge. Then I can start building up some patterns onto that. So where I'm getting all these kind of sort of hook areas, they can become pattern as well. And I want to still really intensify the line work on here. I want to get loads of line packed in so that it's going to put shadow into the surface of this sort of monolith. And again, it's back to building up all these patterns with tightly packed lines, but still thinking about an overall kind of vertical line coming down, so that it's keeping that form being being strong and having that towering kind of quality. But now I can put in some patterns and swirls, because we've now discovered that these are sort of some sort of carved ancient monument that's been sitting on this beach for millennia. And you can imagine Tony Robinson from Time Team leaping around, excavating, nearby and getting excited. And people, speculating and sort of like, making up ghost stories around them. Something like that. There is something slightly, there is something very stark, and in the original photograph, there is something very powerful about them. They look like that very sort of like, bowed but not beaten kind of. Obviously, they've been surviving the elements for quite some time, and, they have that, it's an odd word to say, but almost nobility, I think, about them, and they're sort of like, they've stood the test of time and they're still here, come rain or shine or storm and wind. And I think that's what makes them. I think that's what draws us to these images. They have this quite lovely metaphorical quality, that we see more in them than just a collection of bits of wood in the sand. There's more going on with them than just their reality, and that's why I think it's so nice to explore those kind of feelings through this kind of artwork, which isn't about what they look like so much as how they kind of make us feel. So there we go. So I think, as you can see, hopefully, we're just going to keep on building that surface up, and we should hopefully have this lovely sense of marching into this sort of landscape, you know, into this sort of strange sea, which is sort of leaping upwards. And I don't know what's going on with that, but I think I just really like it. So there we go. So